Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Fraser, the National Technical Leader within our Environmental Services business line with a focus on the mining sector. I want to thank you for joining Stantec for today's webinar on net zero emissions and climate change resilience for mining. This is the first of what will be a series of webinars with a focus on mining throughout the year. Before we get started, there are a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to go over. All the participant audio is muted during the presentation. If you have a question, please type it in the questions panel on your webinar dashboard. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And today's webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the presentation along with the supporting materials will be sent to you afterwards. Those of you familiar with Stantec like to know that safety is critical to our business. We start every meeting with a safety moment. Today, I'm going to share a safety moment on laptop batteries. And this safety moment is a little personal for me because I actually had this happen to my laptop. So with the new normal of working from home, laptops are staying plugged in and charging continuously. They're no longer getting that downtime, at least during the commute to and from work. So this is resulting in increased instances of battery swelling, particularly for the lithium-ion polymer batteries. So signs of a swollen laptop battery are bulging or cracking of the laptop case. And a way to limit the potential for a swollen battery is to unplug it for a period of time each day. So in today's session, we will explain environmental social governance and climate change risk, pathways to net zero emissions, and building resilience to the impacts of climate change. But first, I will introduce you to today's hosts, Nicole Flanagan, Vicki Corning, and Norm Shippey. Nicole Flanagan is a climate change and sustainability subject matter expert that has over 20 years experience in consulting and government. She has worked across all sectors from very detailed assessments to strategic advisory services at the corporate level. Vicki Corning has 16 years of experience in greenhouse gas emissions management and climate change policy related to consulting services, including work for a variety of mining clients and other industrial and government organizations. And Norm Shippey is a senior climate scientist and the Canadian technical lead for climate vulnerability and adaptation for Stantec. He has over 12 years of experience in consulting and academia. He has worked across all sectors with clients from the international, federal, provincial, municipal, and private sectors to improve climate resiliency for their assets, services, and business needs. I'll now pass you over to Nicole Flanagan, who will explain environmental social governance and climate change risk.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm going to talk a little bit about ESG and climate risks. ESG is short for environmental social governance, and these are really topics that pose an opportunity or a risk to an organization. We know that there's increasing pressure for corporations to align their ESG values with those of stakeholders. ESG is really about identifying those critical elements that are crucial to business and important or crucial to stakeholders, about managing those topics, setting goals, and reporting out on those topics to stakeholders. ESG has really increased in the importance of having strong ESG programs, and is really very similar to what we saw in the health and safety movement 25 years ago, and how quickly that impacted how we do business. Of course, one of the key considerations with ESG is some of the requirements around the recommendations on task force on climate-related financial disclosures that may or may not be impacting you or your organization immediately or in the near future. So let's look at some of the basic steps for creating an ESG program. And the first part is really to identify what is crucial to your organization and stakeholders. And understanding that combination is really, those are key areas to report out on and to actively manage. So that's typically done through a materiality assessment to identify which topics to prioritize and which topics to manage. Once you understand the important risks and opportunities, you can then build a sustainability framework. So what is your organization's commitments? What are the focus areas going to be based on those material topics, and setting goals around those ESG topics? The sustainability report is the last step in the cycle, and that is really about communicating out to stakeholders what it is that you're doing on ESG topics that help them to understand who they're partnering with, who they're investing in, or who they're working for. So how does ESG create value? I think, looking back 10 years ago, everyone really thought that having an ESG program was a cost, but very quickly we're identifying there's a lot of value with that. And value is really what drives the decision to implement and move towards creating a strong ESG program. So having an ESG program improves relationships with customers. We know that employees want to work for companies that do good things and have values similar to theirs. We also know that's increasingly important to millennials, who will soon make up the largest portion of the workforce. Sustainability can drive value creation through looking at opportunities to reduce material consumption. You're also reducing things like transportation of material to site, and other both cost savings and emission reduction opportunities. ESG can result in positive or negative media attention, depending on whether it is a risk or opportunity to you. And all of these things really drive greater profitability, provides more access to lower cost of capital, and generates more engagement with both employees and external stakeholders. All of this, the idea is to drive long-term value and creation for all stakeholders, as opposed to short quarter-to-quarter performance for shareholders. So right now, what we're seeing as key drivers in the mining sector are access to capital. I'm sure many of you have come face to face with the Equator Principles and the new version that now says if you are in a developed country like Canada or US, it's no longer sufficient to rely on the existing regulatory structure to say that you're really doing no harm. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that will soon be a reality for those trading on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and stock exchanges in North America are now in various stages of receiving comments or preparing possible disclosure requirements. Investors, we know that they are shifting towards more sustainable or responsible investments, and that is driving essentially investor base. Many of the times that we are brought in to help clients is because an investor is threatening to walk away, or because an investor made a decision not to invest strictly because they didn't have a sustainability program. We know that more and more customers, or more and more facilities or organizations, are having a hard time just accessing tender documents if they're not committing to certain ESG topics, whether that is conflict minerals, labor issues, or having a commitment to net zero or the use of renewable energy. We also know that carbon costs poses an increased risk, or an increase to operating costs at many of the mining facilities. So some of the key topics, ESG topics, right now are related to environmental compliance, safety, water effluence, rights of Indigenous people, supply chain requirements, and GHG emissions and climate change. These two collectively make up a large part of the TCFD, or Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. When we look at climate change risks and opportunity, there's really two types of risks: the transitional risk and the physical risk. The transitional risk is really about the cost of carbon, as well as behavioral change. The cost of carbon is looking at how regulatory programs are going to impact operating costs. But there's also an opportunity there, that if you can lower emissions, you're lowering compliance costs, but you can also earn allowances when you when you're able to produce at lower than the standards, there is an opportunity to earn allowances or credits that can then be sold or used for future compliance years. But there's also an opportunity of saying we are going to be a net zero organization. And that is the opportunity that allows you access to many of the investors that are looking for that in their investment portfolio. And essentially more and more those that want to do business with companies that are net zero. We also see behavioral change that is driving a number of changes, and we can see a shift in market. We can see new increase in demand or decrease in demand based on what we are anticipating in the future. So how will people in general respond to a low carbon economy in the future? How will millennials choose to have individual ownership of cars, or are they more interested in things like ride sharing, which will bring down some of the demand for certain materials? On the physical climate change side, there's of course the exposure, the vulnerability to assets from the impacts of a climate event. And identifying those risks and building adaptation plans, the opportunity is to build a more resilient infrastructure, to build more resilient supply chains. And Norm is going to talk about this in one of the later presentations. So with that, I do have a polling question for the audience. And these are anonymous. We don't know who answers these questions or what the answers are. So the first question is, which of the following do you believe is the most material topic in the mining sector? A, rights of Indigenous people. B, physical climate change. C, water and effluent. Or D, greenhouse gas emissions and carbon costs. And with that, I'll send it back to Michelle, who will reveal the answers.
Yeah, we'll just give everyone a minute to answer the poll. And here we have the results of the poll. It seems the majority of attendees feel that the greenhouse gas emissions and carbon costs are the most material topic in the mining sector, with water and effluent and rights of Indigenous people coming in close second. Thank you, Nicole, for your presentation on environmental, social governance, and climate change risk. Just a reminder to put your questions into the chat box, and we'll have a panel discussion at the end of the presentation. I will now pass the presentation over to Vicki Corning, who will provide a discussion on pathways to net zero emissions.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why net zero has become the new benchmark, and then provide a little bit of history about who's committed to that target so far, and then cover some net zero planning considerations and mining technology opportunities. So why net zero has become the new best-in-class benchmark? Although the Paris Agreement doesn't specifically mention net zero, based on the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, leading scientists have identified that net zero is the necessary target by around 2050 for us to meet the Paris Agreement targets for global warming, of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees over the next century. So far, we're not quite on track with that based on some recent UN reports. We're seeing that based on all the targets that are set now, we're still looking at up to a 3-degree increase in global warming. As Nicole talked about, we're also seeing investors and demanding more on the financial side. Public and investors are having higher and higher expectations of corporations and governments to demonstrate climate change action the demand for low carbon products is increasing, and the task force on climate change related financial disclosures that Nicole mentioned is just one of many initiatives and coalitions that are coming out. Another recent one is a coalition of finance ministers for climate action, which has already attracted 55 members. So more and more we're seeing that disclosure on climate risk is becoming a mandatory item in key financial markets. Carbon pricing is driving large emitters to achieve reductions through direct actions and technology development over time. We're looking here at the current carbon pricing in Canada. So right now we're at $30 a ton, and the current plan is for that price to go up to $170 a ton by 2030. Beyond 2030, we have unknown risk of cost of compliance. There's also cost of fossil fuels for consumers expected to continue to climb with carbon pricing, and that's going to drive an energy transition towards a low carbon economy. So who's made a net zero commitment so far? Sweden was the first nation to put net zero into law back in 2017. They targeted 2045 as their target for net zero. UK was the first G7 economy to legislate net zero by 2050 in 2019. Then 2020, China followed, the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. They've committed to net zero by 2060. By 2021, we have 2/3 of the global economy having made net zero pledges, including all the G7 nations. The United States just recently rejoined the Paris Agreement in January, and they're actually hosting a climate summit today and tomorrow with 40 global leaders in attempts to solidify the efforts of major economies to tackle the climate crisis. Canada has proposed net zero legislation and is planning to roll out more information on that this year. And then we have numerous private companies, provinces, and local governments making net zero commitments. More than 750 major corporations have committed to science-based targets, and that number is growing daily. A little bit more about Canada's initiatives. As of February of this year, the government has set up an independent group of experts that's going to consult with Canadians and provide advice on the best pathways to net zero in our country. There's a net zero accelerator fund that has just recently been announced, and that fund has up to $3 billion in investments planned over the next 5 years. There is information available there now for projects that companies may have. It's targeted towards large emitters. The type of preliminary information the government's looking for are details on what efforts are going to be made to minimize environmental footprint of the company, what metrics, targets, and timeframes would be used, other environmental benefits of your project, and any project linkages that you might have to government environmental priorities. Later this year, we expect the launch of the Net Zero Challenge, which is a voluntary initiative to encourage Canadian companies to work towards net zero by 2050. And the Strategic Assessment for Climate Change Guidance has been recently released, which requires new major projects with a lifetime beyond 2050 to have a credible plan towards net zero by 2050. So what is net zero? The definition of that is essentially that human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere will be balanced by human-directed removals over a specified period. So how far do you go to take ownership of emissions you may have some control over? We're seeing some net zero plans have a target of scope 1 emissions, which are your on-site emissions. Electricity off-site, which would be scope 2, are a required item to include because that's essential to your operation. But then when you look downstream or upstream in your value chain, scope 3 emissions Some people are considering those as well, where others are leaving them out. There's also various assumptions that need to be made in terms of what future technological breakthroughs are going to happen to make hitting net zero possible. The strategic assessment for climate change requires that as part of your net zero plan, you demonstrate how you will achieve net zero by 2050, but it doesn't require looking at upstream emissions. Offset credits can be included within a strategic assessment under an environmental assessment process, whereas most governments are looking for net zero to be achieved by removals as opposed to offset purchases necessarily. So the goal of net zero is a target for the economy as a whole. And in looking at some sectors, there are technologies that exist now that we can use to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Electricity from renewables and nuclear generation is considered net zero. Transportation run on that renewable electricity, or hydrogen fueled vehicles where the hydrogen can be produced with renewables. The well insulated buildings also run on carbon neutral electricity. So you're seeing a theme of electrification and low carbon or no carbon electricity as a major requirement of achieving net zero. Industrial processes are also being reviewed to identify how greenhouse gas emissions from those can be reduced or brought to net zero. So for some sectors, the options are there now, whereas other sectors, the options are currently limited. So we're going to see some emissions remaining in 2050 that will have to be offset. When we talk about offsets, we're looking at options for carbon capture or carbon sequestration. In terms of evaluating a plan towards net zero, there's no single answer. The options include wind, solar, nuclear, hydrogen. Energy storage is something that's growing, looking at your fugitive emissions and managing those, improving energy efficiency. So companies are taking a portfolio-based approach to overall reduction, looking for the best opportunities within their organization. There's a requirement to consider carbon pricing and how the price of carbon is going to drive that investment. A good plan will have interim targets, so something might not be feasible to do in the next 3 years, but thinking about how technology is going to advance, companies are identifying reductions along the path to 2050. It's important to identify economic and non-financial metrics. So economic indicators like return on investment, dollars per ton CO2 reduced can be used, but then you can use non-financial metrics like waste reduction, increased biodiversity, or water use reduction to also evaluate the benefits that might be able to be achieved from different actions. And it's also important to incorporate resiliency considerations. Oops. So the steps to doing a net zero strategy, step one is to quantify your current emissions and then forecast them out for a business as usual scenario to the end of your project life. So business as usual would consider the emissions that are expected to occur if you do nothing. As part of that business as usual, you need to look at reasonable assumptions for technology advances that are going to be legislated or electrical grid intensity changes that are anticipated if your project's grid tied. Then you would go through an evaluation of economic and technical feasibility of various potential actions or best available technologies. now, and then with increasing cost of carbon, which, as I mentioned, is only available out to 2030 at this point. After that, you would evaluate risks and opportunities and develop recommendations, and then develop a plan and roadmap with monitoring and follow-up to reevaluate that. So a good net zero plan would include strategies to reconsider on an ongoing basis, re-examine your priorities and the potential returns on investment with the changing costs of carbon and the changing costs and advancements in technology. The plan should include mechanisms to integrate the greenhouse gas management into your operations and business practices. So some examples of that include senior management commitment, define corporate spending on climate change action, and having reduction targets tied to your executives team compensation. It's also important to involve key departments in your organization in evaluating and brainstorming on reduction opportunities, and to embed the actions in your asset management planning processes wherever possible. Consideration of best available technologies, findings and opportunities for uptake throughout the life cycle of your facilities. And then including strategies for partnerships and advocacy for supportive actions by government. So for example, legislation that will improve low carbon electrification opportunities, or ensuring that there is a robust offset system available in the event that you can't fully go to net zero. In terms of some mining technologies and opportunities that we're seeing right now, renewable energy is obviously a big one. There is a challenge for some remote mine sites in terms of getting grid-tied electricity, but we're seeing an opportunity in on-site wind, solar, and small modular reactors are also being researched for potential industrial use. As of 2015, there was 600 megawatts installed renewables, either sited on or servicing mines, whereas by 2019, it's reported that there are over 5 gigawatts installed around the world. So that's a big upswing that we're seeing in just 4 years, and that's expected to continue. The pursuit of higher grade ores will obviously reduce the energy required to produce the metals, whereas projects in areas with low carbon grid power are also being identified as potentially being more advantageous. There's an emerging trend that there's a potential for source dependent commodity pricing, which could reflect the carbon intensity of generating metals. Energy efficiency is an opportunity. So looking at your ventilation and cooling, or trying to be more efficient in your processing techniques. Battery electric vehicles are an opportunity, and they have co-benefits, especially underground, around noise reduction, air pollution reduction, and potential financial savings and reduced ventilation requirements. Hydrogen vehicles are also being considered for mining, and the target there would be for on-site hydrogen generation with low or no carbon electricity. Then in terms of supply chain management, identifying procurement policies to drive more sustainable choices is an opportunity. Freight and shipping would be one area for mining where you could have a large influence on greenhouse gas emissions in your supply chain. Those are just a few of the opportunities that are currently either being piloted or already implemented at some mine sites. And I'm going to pass it back to Michelle now to go over the next polling question.
Yeah, so our next poll is, does your organization have a science-based greenhouse gas target? 1 second, our poll, there we go. Target, so does your organization have a science-based greenhouse gas target and plan? So you could check one of the 4 options there. And we'll just give you a minute, and then we'll present the results. So here we have the results of the poll. So it sounds as though the majority of attendees don't yet have a plan, but there are quite a number of attendees that are thinking about putting one together, targeting and planned authorization with policies and procedures, as well as they have a plan or it's not operationalized yet. Excellent. Thank you, Vicki, for those strategies with respect to carbon neutrality. Now we will hear from Norm on building resilience to the impacts of climate change.
Thanks, Michelle. I still see the poll. There we go. Okay, so thanks, Michelle. So I'll speak now on building resilience to the impacts of climate change. And so from the resiliency perspective, climate change is really affecting things that have been designed in the past quite more frequently than things that we're even designing at the moment. But it's important to consider the way that we have established codes and standards in the past, and it's always been based on historical data. And we've talked a little bit here about the different scenarios that will get us to 1.5 degrees, or what our current business as usual will get us to, which is about 3 to 3.5 degrees by the end of the century of warming. We're currently tracking on the red scenario you see here on the right-hand panel. And our challenge is that from a resiliency perspective, our codes and standards have been designed based on historical information, and the rate of change of climate is faster than we can adapt those codes. And so the process here is really important to understand that anything that's been designed really could be at risk from climate change under future scenarios, particularly by the end of the century, but even by the middle of the century, as we see about 2 degrees to 3 degrees of warming even by mid-century. And so one way to use this, and we're using the example of building codes here, is that over time, codes should be using climate change information that we're projecting to actually extend out what those codes might look like by mid-century and end of century. And the types of parameters that we're talking about when it comes to codes and standards around resilience have to do with temperature, precipitation and moisture, wind, and kind of snow and ice. So you can imagine from a mining perspective, things like annual 1-day and 15-minute rainfalls could be very important to understand in the future due to different types of flooding concerns that you might have. At the same time, permafrost, depending on where mining locations are, snow loads and ice accretion loads can all have impacts that are very, very distinct within the system. One kind of important thing here too is the distinction of climate versus weather. And when it comes to the risk assessment process, we often have to use weather and weather-related information to understand our climate. And so when I'm talking climate here, we're talking the long-term measurements of weather-related parameters. So those would be 30 to or more years of information gathered at seasonal, annual, and kind of multi-decadal timeframes. And it often covers a broad geography. Weather as an option is kind of more of a short-term issue that can change rapidly and maybe localized to kind of a small area. Also much harder to predict. So when we're talking about climate, we can talk about large-scale signals. One way to think about climate versus weather is if you think about a wardrobe. With climate, that essentially is where you buy all of your clothing that's in your wardrobe. You base it upon what you might have for an entire year's worth of weather, versus on the day-to-day basis, you're picking out your outfit based upon the single potential day of weather that you're facing. From a resiliency approach, we have pretty much a 6-step process that's accepted within the industry. And in general, we start with something that we call a hazards assessment. So we look for the climate and weather hazards that impact the infrastructure that you have now. That goes into an asset assessment to understand what different types of assets are at risk from the hazards. moving forward into an impact assessment where you understand the impacts that are coming from the hazards to those assets. All of this goes together into what we call consequence scoring. So we rate the impacts that you see on kind of a 1 to 5 scale to understand how severe they might be. All of that comes forward into a risk assessment where we understand the probability of occurrence of the hazards that you see and the consequences that you've rated to give us a risk score. And then all of that leads forward into adaptation and resiliency planning going forward to increase the resiliency of your assets to future climate change. So the risk assessment process is relatively simple, and this can be used outside of just natural hazards and climate, but it could be used for physical climate risks that are either man-made or otherwise. In general, we have what we call a threat, and then we have our elements that are at risk, which could be infrastructure, could be buildings, could be facilities, or could be your environmental activities, or even a community. So we ask ourselves, we choose our threats and we ask ourselves, are we exposed to that threat? Is the infrastructure, building, facility, mine that we're looking at exposed to that threat? And if so, what's its vulnerability? And based on that vulnerability, we assign what we call the impact or consequence score if that event materializes. At the same time as we're looking at this impact and consequence score, we're trying to understand if there's a hazard, what intensity threshold does it need to be at to cause actual impacts? And what's the probability of that hazard occurring? And we combine this information into our risk, which turns into probability times our impact or consequence scoring. So I'll use an example here of a community, and we're going to focus in on a community. Maybe this is the community right outside of a mine. And we'll focus in on this bridge, which might be critical to bringing our supplies to and from our location. So the bridge here, under normal conditions, normal day of climate that we've designed for, is exposed to normal conditions. So we've designed it for a specific load and a specific capacity. And so that load here on a normal day is not exceeding our capacity. We're not going past our safety factors, and on a normal day, the bridge is operating just fine. What we're going to introduce now are what we'll call 2 different rainstorms. So this is our first rainstorm, and you'll notice there have been some changes to the community. Here we had a culvert that is now blocked up because the water level is higher. The river might be higher, and we might be having some minor flooding. There's still people outside doing things as normal. In this rainstorm, what has happened is our water level in the river has gone up. We're introducing new loads onto the bridge piers and some of maybe scouring and erosion happening around those piers. But in general, our bridge is still not truly at risk from this storm because we haven't exceeded our capacity. We've added a little bit of additional load, but the bridge is still able to withstand this. If we had another event happening at the same time as this rainstorm, perhaps we would actually exceed our capacity and have some more issues, and we might have to consider those risks. So if we take our storm and we turn it into a secondary storm here that's much more severe, we've got thunder and lightning and wind, you'll notice that our flooding is much more severe throughout the community. People are still outside for some reason, and these guys could probably flip their boat over. But in general, the community is much more impacted here. And so if we zoom in a little bit more on that bridge, what we've caused is a failure of the bridge just due to the fact that the river has raised so much more. And so this threshold might be the point at which the bridge deck fails or the piers fail or some piece of that infrastructure has a critical impact. And so for our example here, what we've done is we've increased the load on our bridge by so much that we've caused a failure. And that over-the-top failure here is essentially our unmitigated risk. How this looks in terms of the assessment is that we use a heat map here to understand essentially how a risk might manifest between different categories. So green here would represent low risk interactions, blue would kind of represent low to moderate, yellow would represent moderate, and so on, high and extreme. we're going to talk about our flood. We're really interested in the top corner here, and this is where we want to have most of our adaptation actions if we have risks in this area. So let's use our flood as an example. And the rating here, so 1 being something that's very low, 5 being something that's catastrophic. If we use our flood from the last example, we would say that that's a catastrophic flood. It's caused major impacts to our infrastructure, but it's an event that probably doesn't happen very often. It's not something that we would have designed for. So it may have a very low probability of occurrence, but it has a very catastrophic risk. What happens with climate change is it's introducing a change in the frequency of these events happening. So something that might be very rare now becomes much more frequent into the future. So maybe our 100-year storm becomes a 25-year storm. And the problem becomes that just based on using the same impacts from that same type of storm, we go from something that's a moderate risk to something that's an extreme risk. And this is where we introduce our adaptation actions to try to bring our risk level back down to something that's either the same or lower than where it was before. Maybe we can bring our consequences through either re-engineering, or maybe there's green infrastructure or specific adaptation actions that can help us get to that point. The way that this looks, the risk ratings that you see there, they're 1 to 5 essentially on each scale. So anything that falls into a high or extreme here typically have high priority measures that are required, or controls in terms of adaptation that are needed almost immediately. One way that we could look at this too, from a mining perspective, is that our flood could cause cascading impacts and need for interventions. And so our flood here might cause some issue where we need to adapt. Maybe our flood is causing issues with tailing ponds overflowing, or that overflow might become an environmental and health and safety concern. Once we've identified what we might need to do to adapt, we might have ways to manage that. Maybe it's a simple thing where it's a small spill that we don't want any spills, but if it's a small spill that we can mitigate, or we can resize our tailing ponds, then maybe our staff works to clean that up and we redesign it a bit. And then the other challenge here is that there might be some operational cost to that issue, right? So our monitoring here might be additional O&M costs just due to these events. So we want to make sure that we're monitoring and understanding our additional costs here. And perhaps to manage all of this, you have an emergency plan that you can enact some sort of new information into based on the climate change impacts. And that could even be your main adaptation action, is reinforcing your emergency plans. So I will turn it back to Michelle here for our last poll.
Thank you, Norm. So our last poll is, what types of climate hazards currently cause impacts to your assets and infrastructure? I'll give you a couple minutes to respond. Here we have the results of the poll. So the climate hazards that currently impact attendees' assets and infrastructure is mainly linked to heavy rainfall events, with wildfire, fire, and smoke a close second. So we'll now go to the chat box for your questions. Please type any additional questions into the chat box, and we'll try to get to them in the order they were received. So our first question is for Norm. How do you determine how far out you look at physical climate change risk?
Thanks, Michelle. And so in general, climate time horizons and asset time horizons are looked to be linked. So you want to understand how long your operating life is for your infrastructure to assign the appropriate climate change horizons around that. So if you had an asset that has a design life of 30 years, you want to look at a 30-year climate horizon from when that was originally designed.
Thank you, Norm. And the next question's for Nicole. How feasible is electrification as a potential action to reduce emissions?
That's a good question. So it's very dependent on the region that you're in. So the province itself, how emission intense the electricity generation is or is not. I would say some provinces are much higher. All of the provinces do have an outlook that shows declining emission intensity associated with electricity. But obviously, some provinces will take longer to reduce that intensity than others. I would also say it depends on the risk tolerance too of an organization, because in some cases there is a bit of a gamble that some of the higher emission intensity electricity is going to reach some of the targets that have been set. So I think it really is, you need to look at it in light of each province right now, in light of each province over the time frame that you want to reduce emissions as well.
Excellent, thank you, Nicole. So we have a question here for Vicki. So regarding the second poll question, is there any measure which is being operational at the Stantec mining sector?
I'm not sure I
believe it was in response to the second poll. We could just bring up those. So does your organization have a science-based GHG target and plan? So is there any measure which is being operational at the Stantec mining sector? So I know our CEO was on this week or last week and announced Stantec's net zero emission plan, if that's what the question is with regards to. So yes, Stantec has issued a plan that we're working towards internally, which would include the mining sector.
Yeah, so I would say Stantec is in progress of operationalizing our target of net zero. We're learning a lot through that process for sure.
The next question we have for Nicole. Have you observed any mining companies deploying reforestation, afforestation strategy to meet net zero goals?
Thanks, Michelle. We have not seen that yet. Typically, land-based projects do not, well, there is obviously the carbon sequestered in the forest. Typically, the amount of carbon is, or greenhouse gas emissions is quite low. So it takes a very large amount of land to achieve significant emissions or carbon sequestration. So I would say not yet. I do think we're going to see more of that potentially under programs such as the Strategic Assessment of Climate Change when mines are permitted.
Excellent. I think there's another question for you, Nicole, here. In relation to the strategic assessment of climate change requirements for a net zero emissions plan, do you see any roadblocks for mining companies to be able to develop these types of plans?
I think it's gonna be so the net zero planning is really development of a strategy. And I think one of the key things that came out in the I'm going to say the second final version of the strategic assessment of climate change was the ability to revisit and to adjust net zero plans on a regular basis. I think it's important to provide the strategy that you're going to implement to evaluate and assess as much as it is to actually show a path forward. I also think that there is the most difficult and challenging part, I think, will be the trade-off between economics and technical feasibility and actual GHG emission reductions. And I think it can be done. I think it will be a bit of a challenge and a bit of a need to consider, you know, all sorts of different aspects. I think return on investment will really be driving the net zero plan for the federal permit. And it will be, we're still anticipating additional guidance documents to be released, but I think there is going to be a significant amount of information required, and it will be very customized to the individual facility.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question for Vicki. Does Stantec have any case studies that they can share on net zero with an operational mining company?
I don't know that we have case studies available right now, but we could certainly put together kind of a mock-up scope of work in terms of what the strategy steps would look like for any specific organization. It's definitely, it needs to be customized depending on the size and the scope of what you're doing and how far out you want to look in terms of, do you want to involve your supply chain, or do you just want to focus on on-site emissions and electricity to start with?
Mm-hmm.
It's all fairly new. So, I mean, we've been working with a number of clients just within the last year on this, and every proposal is a little bit different, but, you know, the steps that I talked about today are the core of it.
All right, thank you, Vicki. And we have a question for Nicole. With respect to the reforestation, how would you see progressive reclamation being incorporated into net zero plans?
So I do think that how I would do it is I would set out and I would look at the eligibility around emission reductions or carbon credits, and I would build my claim or my anticipated sequestered carbon similar to how we would approach an offset system. So I would follow the international standards principles, so the 14064 part 3. I would also look at any program guidance, so what can be considered sequestered carbon. So important to understand what the baseline scenario, what the project scenario is, and what you can claim as a debit to your GHG inventory.
Excellent. And for Norm, how often should a mining company reevaluate its climate resilience plans? Should it be annual, every 5 years?
That's a really great question. So in line with the way that the climate information is updated, we talked about IPCC a little bit. Those reports are every 6 years or so with new refreshes of climate information. That's actually a pretty good cycle or area to look for. So 5 to 6 years makes sense. And it oftentimes isn't a brand new plan. It's just updates and making sure that you're still in line with the latest projections and information, and potentially any extremes that have happened in between your planning cycle.
Excellent. Nicole, we have a question on Are there any government plans or initiatives to incent GHG reductions through installation of new electricity assets using renewable technologies?
Good question. There are a number of initiatives out there, and more coming up all the time. I do think that the Strategic Innovation Fund is definitely worth looking into. There is a component of that looks at how emissions can be reduced through different technologies. I would say there potentially is a number of programs through Infrastructure Bank. There are a number of programs right now. The Accelerator Fund that Vicki mentioned is one of them as well.
Excellent. And we've got one here. Are you aware of any synergies that could be taken advantage of between tailings reclamation and carbon reduction? This is for the panel, whoever wants to jump in.
I could answer that. I guess it all comes down to when you're looking at land use, looking at your existing conditions or your business as usual scenario. So identifying what the carbon footprint of your tailings are in terms of is there any sequestration there? Are there any greenhouse gas emissions happening? And then with your reclamation, if you can achieve a state where you've vegetated it in such a way that you can have some carbon sequestration happening, then there would be a potential offset. But as Nicole mentioned, for reforestation, it's not likely to be a large amount of reduction in the grand scheme of things when you look at the energy intensity of mining versus what you might be able to achieve there. But there's definitely co-benefits of reducing and reclaiming tailings that, you know, could give you some positive, you know, something positive to talk about with your stakeholders and with the public. So it's worth looking into, but probably not a large greenhouse gas impact.
And I think we've got our final question. Thoughts on whether the pandemic has helped hurt with respect to meeting the targets from the Paris Agreement? And that's for Vicki, sorry.
I don't know where we're at now, if we can really say. I mean, there's definitely been a lot of talk about emissions reductions because of the pandemic around transportation. And I know a lot of organizations have reduced their emissions by having staff work from home, which has been forced by the pandemic. And I know at Stantec now, that's one of, you know, part of our net zero initiative is to look at how we work and really give staff the opportunity to work from home if they're more comfortable doing that. And we would be able to achieve a reduction in our office space and the associated emissions in doing that. So I guess that was kind of somewhat related to the pandemic, maybe. So I think just because of the push towards net zero based on the scientific evidence that we have now, those types of decisions would have come about anyway. So it will be interesting to see how things like public travel change as the pandemic hopefully winds down. But we could be optimistic and hope that it's maybe helped us to take a step in the right direction.
Excellent. That looks like all the time we have for questions for now. So please feel free to reach out directly to Nicole, Vicki, and Norm with any other questions you have or to talk more about your own project requirements. Thank you to everyone who joined today's session. A recording of the webinar will be sent to each of you along with the contact information for the presenters. We would sincerely appreciate your feedback on today's presentation, along with any requests for future sessions that you are interested in, as we do plan to continue this webinar series throughout the year. On that note, our next presentation will be on May 18th. John Treen, our mining business leader, is hosting a panel interview with mine operators to discuss how they are approaching net zero and how they're instituting that change now. So a link to the registration for this panel interview on May 18th will be sent in the follow-up email that includes the recording of today's webinar. So until next time, on behalf of Nicole, Vicki, and Norm, and the rest of the Stantec team, thank you for your time.